The woman's body lay crumpled at the edge of Kade Yates's property line like a discarded rag doll, her calico dress torn and dust-covered, one arm stretched toward the mountains as if reaching for salvation that had never come. Kade had been checking his trap lines in the foothills above Petaluma, California, that scorching August morning in 1879 when he spotted the splash of faded blue fabric against the dry golden grass. His massive frame went rigid, every muscle in his broad shoulders tensing as he urged his horse forward. The mountain man had lived alone in these hills for 5 years, and in all that time he had never found another soul this far up the ridge. His property sat at the boundary between civilization and true wilderness, where the rolling California hills gave way to steeper terrain that most folks had sense enough to avoid. He dismounted in one fluid motion despite his size, his boots hitting the ground hard as he ran toward her. Long dark hair fell across his weathered face as he dropped to his knees beside her, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for a pulse at her throat. There. Faint, but there. She was alive, though God only knew for how long she would stay that way. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin burned raw by the relentless sun. She wore no bonnet, no shawl, nothing to protect her from the elements. Dark circles shadowed her closed eyes, and her breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps. Kade's jaw clenched as he took in the bruises on her wrists, the fingerprint marks on her upper arms visible even through the dirt. Someone had grabbed her, hard. Someone had hurt her. His hands worked quickly, checking for broken bones, for snake bites, for anything that might kill her before he could get her to shelter. She was thin, too thin, and dehydrated to the point of death. Without thinking twice, Kade scooped her into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. His years working timber in Oregon before coming to California had built muscles upon muscles, and his life in the mountains had kept him strong. She felt fragile against his chest, and something protective surged through him so powerfully it nearly staggered him. He settled her across his saddle, then swung up behind her, cradling her against him as he turned his horse toward home. His cabin sat another mile up the ridge, tucked into a small valley with a creek running through it. It was rough living, but it was honest, and it was his. As he rode, he tried to understand what could have brought a woman so far from town in such condition. Petaluma sat a good 8 miles down the mountain, a thriving little settlement that served the ranchers and farmers scattered throughout Sonoma County. Women did not simply wander into the wilderness alone, not dressed for a social call, not without supplies or a horse of their own. The answer that came to him made his blood run cold. She had not wandered. Someone had left her there, left her to die. His cabin came into view, a solid structure he had built with his own hands from timber he had felled and milled himself. Smoke still rose from the chimney where he had banked the morning fire. He dismounted carefully, lifting the unconscious woman with him, and carried her inside. The interior was simple but clean, one large room that served as kitchen, living space, and sleeping quarters. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and his bed occupied the far corner, covered with fur pelts and wool blankets. Kade laid her on his bed, then immediately set about trying to save her life. He had water, thank God, cool and clean from the creek. He soaked a cloth and began moistening her lips, squeezing tiny drops into her mouth. Too much at once would make her sick, but she needed water desperately. Her body was shutting down from lack of it. As he worked, he studied her face. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with delicate features that might have been pretty if they were not so ravaged by exposure. Her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins and lay in tangled waves across his pillow. She wore a simple gold band on her left hand. Married, then, which made this whole situation even darker. Had her husband done this? The thought made rage coil in his gut like a living thing. What kind of man would abandon his wife in the wilderness to die? For 3 days, Kade barely left her side. He continued the slow process of rehydrating her, graduating from drops on her lips to spoonfuls of water mixed with a little honey. He made bone broth from venison and coaxed it into her mouth, watching her throat work as she swallowed unconsciously. He bathed her face and arms with cool water to bring down the fever that raged through her sunburned body. He treated the worst of her burns with a salve made from herbs he gathered in the mountains, an old recipe a Pomo woman had taught him years ago. On the evening of the 3rd day, Her eyes finally opened. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they stared up at him with confusion and fear. She tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. A small sound of distress escaped her throat. "Easy," Kade said, his voice rough from disuse. He lived alone and went days sometimes without speaking aloud. "You are safe. You are in my cabin. I found you 3 days ago, nearly dead." Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the rough log walls, the fireplace, the simple furniture. When her gaze returned to him, he saw the exact moment she registered his size, the breadth of his shoulders, the thick muscles of his arms visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves. But instead of more fear, something like relief flickered across her face. "Water," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He helped her sit up slightly, supporting her shoulders with one arm while he held a cup to her lips with his other hand. She drank greedily, and he had to pull it away. "Slow," he said. "Too much will make you sick." She nodded, exhaustion already pulling at her features. But before she slipped back into sleep, she whispered 2 words that confirmed his worst suspicions. "He left me." Those 3 words hung in the air long after she lost consciousness again. Kade sat back in his chair, his hands curling into fists. "He left me. Someone had brought this woman up into the hills and abandoned her to die. The cruelty of it, the calculated evil, made him want to put his fist through a wall. Instead, he stood and walked outside, needing the cool evening air to calm the fury burning in his chest. The sun was setting over the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. His property stretched out before him, 300 acres of rough California wilderness that he had claimed and held through sheer determination and hard work. He had come here seeking solitude, running from memories of a war that still haunted his dreams and a world that had grown too complicated for his liking. Now that solitude had been shattered by a woman with storm-gray eyes and bruises on her wrists. The next morning, she was awake when he came in from checking his horses. She was sitting up in bed, the blankets pulled around her shoulders, watching the door with those steady gray eyes. In the daylight, he could see that her burns were healing, the angry red fading to pink. She looked stronger, though still terribly fragile. "I am Kade Yates," he said, setting down the bucket of fresh water he had drawn from the creek. "This is my property. You are about 8 miles up the ridge from Petaluma." "Vivian Vance," she replied softly. Her voice was still hoarse but clearer than before. "I remember you finding me. Or I think I do. It feels like a dream." It was no dream. He poured water into a pot to heat for coffee. "You were dying. Another few hours and you would have been past saving." She was quiet for a long moment. "Why did you save me?" The question surprised him. Why would I not? Some men would not have bothered. With a woman in my position. He turned to look at her fully, his dark eyes serious. "And what position is that?" Vivian's hands twisted in the blanket. "My husband brought me up here 5 days ago. We had been traveling," he said, "to visit his brother's ranch further north, but when we got to this area, he told me to get out of the wagon. I thought perhaps we were going to have a picnic, or that he needed to fix something. Instead, Her voice broke and she had to pause. "He told me he was done with me, that I was useless to him. He said the mountains would take care of his problem, and no one would ever know what happened to me." Rage, white-hot and fierce, flooded through Kade. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "He said this to you? Your own husband?" She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks now. "I begged him. I told him I would do better, be better, whatever he wanted. But he just laughed. He got back in the wagon and left me there. I tried to follow, but he whipped the horses and disappeared down the mountain. I did not even know which direction to walk. I wandered for hours before I collapsed. I do not remember anything after that until I woke up here." Kade's massive hands opened and closed at his sides. He wanted to find this man, this coward who called himself a husband, and teach him what it felt like to be helpless and afraid. But that would come later. Right now, Vivian needed care, not vengeance. "You are safe here," he said firmly. "Whatever his reasons, whatever he thought would happen, you survived. You are under my protection now." The way her eyes widened, the relief that washed over her face, told him how desperately she had needed to hear those words. She had been abandoned by the one person who had sworn to protect her, left to die alone in the wilderness. The betrayal of it was almost worse than the physical danger. Over the following week, Vivian grew stronger. Kade was surprised by her resilience. Despite everything she had endured, despite the trauma of her husband's betrayal, she did not collapse into despair. Instead, she got up. She began helping around the cabin despite his protests, insisting that she could not simply lie in bed when there was work to be done. She washed dishes and mended his shirts with needle and thread from a small sewing kit he kept for repairing gear. She fed the chickens he kept in a coop behind the cabin and gathered their eggs. She moved slowly at first, her burned skin still tender and her body weak from her ordeal. But she moved. Kade found himself watching her when he thought she was not paying attention. There was something compelling about her quiet strength, the way she refused to be broken by what had happened to her. She was not a large woman. The top of her head barely reached his shoulder, but there was steel in her spine that he recognized and respected. They fell into an easy routine. Kade would rise before dawn and tend to the animals, check his trap lines, hunt, or work on whatever projects needed attention around his property. Vivian would prepare simple meals from the supplies he kept and maintain the cabin. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. It was during these evening conversations that Kade learned her story. Vivian had been born in Sacramento, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. She had married Charles Vance 3 years ago when she was 22, believing him to be a successful merchant. It was only after the wedding that she discovered his business was failing, that he was drowning in debt, and that his temper was vicious. "He had a policy on my life," she told Kade one night, staring into the fire. "I found the papers 6 months ago. If I died, he would receive $500. That is when I realized he was planning something. I just did not know what until he brought me here." "Did you tell anyone? The sheriff? Your family?" She shook her head. "My parents both passed 2 years ago within months of each other. I have no siblings. And Charles was always so charming in public. Everyone in Sacramento thought he was a fine husband. Who would have believed me if I said he wanted me dead?" Kade's hands tightened on his coffee cup. The injustice of it burned in his chest. A woman could be trapped in a marriage to a monster, and society offered her no escape, no protection. The law saw her as her husband's property, and if he chose to abuse that property, there was little she could do. "He will not touch you again," Kade said, his voice low and fierce. "I swear it on my life." Vivian looked at him and something shifted in her expression. "Why are you being so kind to me? You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Kade was silent for a long moment, trying to put his feelings into words. "I have seen too much cruelty in this world," he said finally. "During the war, after the war, in every town and on every frontier. I have seen men use their strength to hurt those weaker than them, and I have seen good people suffer because of it. When I came to these mountains, I swore I was done with all of that. But then I found you, and I realized that turning my back on the world means nothing if I turn my back on someone who needs help." "You were in the war?" "Union Army. I was at Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Petersburg. Saw the elephant, as they say, and it changed me." He stared into the fire, old memories flickering behind his eyes. "When it was over, yes, I could not go back to regular life. Could not stand being in cities, being around crowds. So I went west, worked timber in Oregon for a while, then came down here to California and claimed this land. Been here 5 years now." "It is beautiful here," Vivian said softly. "Harsh, but beautiful." "It is honest," Kade replied. "The mountains do not lie to you. If you respect them, they will provide. If you are foolish, they will kill you. But they do not pretend to be something they are not." As the days stretched into weeks, something began to change between them. It was subtle at first, just small moments that lingered a bit too long. Vivian's hand would brush against his when she passed him a plate, and neither of them would pull away immediately. Kade would help her carry water from the creek, and his hands would steady her waist for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. They began to seek out each other's company, finding excuses to work side by side even when it would have been more efficient to work separately. Kade had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to share space with another person. But Vivian fit into his life with surprising ease. She was quiet when he needed silence, conversational when he wanted company. She understood the rhythms of his days and adapted to them without complaint. More than that, she was interested in his work. She asked him about the mountains, about the plants and animals, about how he survived through the harsh California winters. One afternoon in early September, Kade was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard Vivian scream. He dropped the axe and ran, his heart pounding, every protective instinct roaring to life. He burst around the corner of the cabin to find her standing frozen near the chicken coop, staring at a massive rattlesnake coiled near her feet. Without thinking, Kade grabbed his hunting knife from his belt and threw it in one smooth motion. The blade caught the snake just behind the head, pinning it to the ground. It thrashed once, twice, then went still. Vivian stumbled backward, and Kade caught her. She was shaking, her face pale, and without thinking, he pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, and he could feel her heart racing against him. "You are safe," he murmured into her hair. "I have you." She clung to him, her fingers digging into his shirt. "I'm sorry. I know it was just a snake, but a rattlesnake that size could kill you in minutes. You had every right to be scared." He pulled back just enough to look down at her, one hand coming up to cup her face. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she probably did not even know she had shed. "You are safe here, Vivian. I will always keep you safe." Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to crackle with sudden electricity. Kade was intensely aware of how perfectly she fit against him, how right it felt to hold her. Her lips were parted slightly, her gray eyes wide and locked on his. He started to pull away to release her before he did something foolish, but her hand came up to cover his where it still cupped her face. "Kade," she whispered, and there was something in the way she said his name that broke the last of his restraint. He kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But instead, she melted into him, her free hand sliding up to tangle in his long hair. The kiss deepened, and Kade felt like he was falling off a cliff, plummeting into something vast and terrifying and wonderful all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kade rested his forehead against hers. "I should not have done that." "Why not?" "Because you are vulnerable right now. Because you have been through hell and you are still healing. Because I do not want you to think that I expect anything from you in exchange for helping you." Vivian pulled back enough to look at him fully, her gray eyes serious. "Is that what you think? That I would kiss you out of obligation?" "I do not know what to think. I only know that I have wanted to do that for weeks, and I am terrified that I am taking advantage of your situation." A small smile tugged at her lips, the first real smile he had seen from her since he found her. "Kade Yates, you are the most honorable man I have ever met. You saved my life. You have asked for nothing in return. You have treated me with more respect and kindness than my own husband ever did. If I wanted to kiss you, it is because I wanted to, not because I owe you anything." "Your husband," Kade said, the word bitter on his tongue. "You're still married to him, Vivian. That's a problem." Her smile faded. "I know. Legally, I'm still his wife. But he abandoned me to die, Kade. He does not want me. He tried to kill me. Does that not sever whatever bonds might have existed? I do not know what the law says, but I know what I feel, and I feel like I am stealing something that belongs to another man, even if that man is a monster who does not deserve you." Vivian reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his bearded jaw. "I do not belong to Charles. I never really did. But if you want me, Kade, if you feel even a fraction of what I feel for you, then I could belong to you, if you would have me." The offer hung between them, enormous in its implications. Kade knew that taking Vivian as his own, even if it was what they both wanted, would be complicated. If Charles Vance came looking for her, if he claimed his rights as her husband, there could be legal troubles. There could be violence. But looking down into her gray eyes, feeling the way she fit perfectly in his arms, Kade knew his answer. "I want you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you more than I have wanted anything in my entire life. And if that makes me a thief, then so be it. You are mine now, Vivian. Mine to protect, mine to care for, mine to love if you will let me." "Yes," she breathed, and then they were kissing again, and nothing else mattered. That night, Kade insisted that Vivian continue to sleep in his bed while he took the pile of furs by the fire. It nearly killed him to maintain that separation, but he needed her to understand that he was not like Charles. He would not force himself on her or expect her to share his bed just because she had agreed to be his. When she was ready, if she was ever ready, it would be her choice. But if maintaining physical boundaries was difficult, maintaining emotional ones proved impossible. With each passing day, Kade fell more deeply in love with the woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly. He loved her quiet strength, her resilience, her sharp mind. He loved the way she hummed while she worked, the way she laughed at his awkward attempts at humor, the way she looked at him like he was something precious. Vivian, for her part, found herself healing in ways that went far beyond the physical. The burns on her skin faded to pale scars that would eventually disappear. Her body regained the weight she had lost, strength returning to her limbs. But more than that, her spirit began to heal. The fear that had lived in her chest for years, the constant anxiety of living with Charles's temper, began to fade. She felt safe with Kade in a way she had never felt with any man. He was so different from Charles, it was almost laughable. Where Charles had been smooth and manipulative, Kade was honest to the point of bluntness. Where Charles had been cruel, Kade was gentle despite his massive size and obvious strength. Where Charles had sought to control and diminish her, Kade seemed determined to build her up, to help her rediscover the confident woman she had been before her disastrous marriage. In early October, reality came crashing back into their isolated paradise. Kade had gone down to Petaluma for supplies, something he did once a month. Vivian had wanted to come with him, but they had agreed it was safer for her to stay hidden at the cabin. If Charles was looking for her, if anyone had reported her missing, her appearance in town could bring trouble they were not yet ready to face. He was loading flour and coffee into his saddlebags when he heard the conversation at the general store counter. "Shame about that fellow's wife," the shopkeeper was saying to another customer. "Going missing like that." Kade's hand stilled on the bag of coffee beans. "Which fellow is that?" the customer asked. "Charles Vance, out of Sacramento. Been putting up notices all over the county. Says his wife wandered off while they were traveling through about 2 months back. He is offering a $50 reward for information about her whereabouts." $50? That is generous. The shopkeeper shrugged. "He seems real broken up about it. Came through here last week asking if anyone had seen a woman matching her description. Said she was not right in the head, prone to confused spells. Poor man." Kade's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. Charles was not searching out of love or concern. He was covering his tracks, creating a story that would explain Vivian's disappearance if her body was ever found. And he was painting her as mentally unwell, ensuring that if she did surface and told her story, no one would believe her. He finished his purchases quickly and rode hard back up the mountain. Vivian was outside when he arrived, tending to the vegetable garden she had planted near the cabin. She looked up at the sound of his approach, a smile lighting her face, but it faded when she saw his expression. "What is wrong?" He dismounted and told her everything he had heard. As he spoke, he watched the color drain from her face. When he finished, she sat down heavily on the chopping block, her hands trembling. "He is looking for me," she whispered. "He wants to make sure I am dead. Or he wants to establish a story that protects him if your body is found." Kade knelt in front of her, taking her shaking hands in his. "Vivian, we need to decide what we are going to do. We can keep hiding, keep you up here where he will not find you. Or we can fight. We can go to the authorities, tell them what he did, try to see justice done." "They will not believe me," she said flatly. "You heard what the shopkeeper said. Charles is telling everyone I am not right in the head. He has money, he is educated, he is charming. I am just a woman with no proof of anything. It will be his word against mine, and his word will win." Kade knew she was probably right. The law was not kind to women, especially women accusing their husbands of wrongdoing. But the thought of living in hiding, of Vivian always looking over her shoulder, made his blood boil. "Then we leave," he said. "We pack up and go somewhere he will never find you. Montana, Wyoming, Colorado. We can start over somewhere new." "You would give up your home for me?" "Vivian, you are my home now. This land is just dirt and timber. You are what matters." Tears spilled down her cheeks and she threw her arms around his neck. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "I love you too," he replied, holding her tight. "We will figure this out. I promise." They spent the next few days preparing for the possibility of leaving, packing supplies and discussing where they might go. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Kade was hunting deer in the hills above his property when he caught sight of movement in the valley below. A wagon was making its way up the rough trail toward his cabin. His blood went cold. No one came up here unless they were lost or looking for trouble. He abandoned his hunt and raced back toward the cabin, taking shortcuts through the forest that only someone intimately familiar with the terrain could navigate. He arrived just as the wagon pulled into his clearing. A man climbed down, well-dressed in a city suit that looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness. Even from a distance, Kade could see the calculation in his eyes, the cruel set of his mouth. Charles Vance had found them. Vivian stood in the doorway of the cabin, her face pale but composed. She had heard the wagon approaching and had armed herself with Kade's shotgun, though her hands trembled slightly as she held it. "Vivian!" Charles called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "Thank God I've found you. I've been searching everywhere. Are you hurt? Are you well?" "Stay away from me," Vivian said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "You have no right to be here." "No right? I am your husband. You are not well, my dear. You wandered away while you were confused, but I am here now to take you home." "You left me here to die," Vivian said flatly. "You told me yourself that you were done with me, that the mountains would take care of your problem." Charles's expression flickered, annoyance crossing his features before he schooled them back into concern. "You see? You are confused, imagining things. This is exactly why you need proper care. Now put down that gun and come with me." He took a step toward her, and that was when Kade emerged from the tree line. "The lady asked you to stay away," Kade said, his voice low and dangerous. He was carrying his rifle, and while it was not pointed at Charles, the threat was clear. Charles spun around, his eyes widening as he took in Kade's size, the muscles rippling beneath his shirt, the cold fury in his dark eyes. But he recovered quickly, his expression shifting to righteous indignation. "Who are you? What have you done with my wife?" "I saved her life," Kade replied, moving to stand between Charles and Vivian. "Found her collapsed on my property line, nearly dead from exposure and dehydration. Strange thing for a man's wife to be wandering alone in the wilderness, do not you think?" "She is not well," Charles said, his voice taking on an edge. "She needs medical care, proper care, not to be held captive by some mountain savage." Kade's jaw clenched at the insult, but he kept his voice level. "She is not being held captive. She is staying here of her own free will, under my protection, and she will continue to stay here until she decides otherwise. You have no legal right to keep her from me. She is my wife under the law." "And you tried to murder her," Kade shot back. "I would say that nullifies your rights as a husband." Charles's mask finally slipped, fury flashing across his face. "You cannot prove anything. It is the word of an addled woman and a nobody mountain man against mine. No court in California will side with you." "Maybe not," Kade admitted, "but I do not need a court to stop you from taking her. All I need is this rifle and the fact that we are standing on my property, miles from town. You came up here alone, Vance. That was foolish." Understanding dawned in Charles's eyes, and for the first time, Kade saw fear there. Good. Let him know what it felt like to be helpless and afraid. "You would not dare," Charles said, but his voice shook slightly. "You would hang for murder." "Would I? A man comes onto my property, threatens my household, and I defend what is mine. Seems like a clear case of self-defense to me. And like you said, we are miles from town. I could bury you so deep in these mountains that no one would ever find a trace of you." The irony of using Charles's own logic against him was not lost on any of them. Vivian had moved to stand beside Kade now, the shotgun still held ready. The weapon might have been trembling in her grip, but her eyes were steady and cold as they stared at the man who had tried to kill her. "I want a divorce," she said clearly. "You will go back to Sacramento and file papers. You will tell everyone that the marriage did not work out, that we parted ways amicably. You will not contest it, you will not fight it, and you will never come near me again." "And if I refuse?" "Then I go to the authorities and tell them everything," Vivian said. "I tell them about the life insurance policy. I tell them how you brought me up here and abandoned me to die. Yes, they might not believe me at first. But they will investigate. They will find that policy. They will find other people you owe money to, other credible people who can speak to your character, and even if you are not convicted, the scandal will ruin you. No one will do business with a man suspected of trying to murder his wife for insurance money. Charles stood there, his face mottled with rage, but he was trapped, and he knew it. He could not take Vivian by force, not with Kade standing there armed and clearly willing to use violence to protect her. And if he went to the authorities, there was a real risk that Vivian's accusations would stick, especially if the insurance policy came to light. "Fine," he spat finally. "I will file for divorce, but do not expect any settlement from me. You will get nothing." "I do not want your money," Vivian said quietly. "I never did. I just want to be free of you." Charles stalked back to his wagon, every line of his body radiating fury. But before he climbed up, he turned back one last time. "You will regret this, both of you. You think you can just hide away up here and play house? The world does not work that way." "Get off my property," Kade said, his voice cold as winter ice. "And if I ever see you in these mountains again, I will not bother with warnings." Charles snapped the reins, and his wagon lurched forward, heading back down the mountain trail. They watched until he disappeared from sight, and only then did Vivian lower the shotgun. Her whole body was shaking now, adrenaline and relief flooding through her in equal measure. Kade took the gun from her trembling hands and set it aside, then pulled her into his arms. She buried her face against his chest and started to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. He held her through it, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring reassurances. "It is over," he said softly. "He is gone, and he's not coming back. What if he changes his mind? What if he decides it is worth the risk to come after us? Then I will handle it." Kade's voice was absolutely certain. "I meant what I said, Vivian. I will protect you with my life. He will never hurt you again." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun sank lower in the western sky. Finally, Vivian pulled back and looked up at him with red-rimmed but determined eyes. "I need to go to Sacramento," she said. "I need to make sure he actually files those divorce papers, and I need to retrieve my parents' things from his house. He has no right to keep them." "Then we will go," Kade said, "together. I am not letting you face him alone again." A week later, they made the journey to Sacramento. It was Vivian's first time back in the city since Charles had abandoned her, and Kade could see the anxiety in every line of her body as they rode through the familiar streets. But she held her head high, refusing to cower. The house where she had lived with Charles was a modest two-story building on the outskirts of the city. It looked respectable enough from the outside, but Kade could see the small signs of neglect paint peeling around the windows, weeds growing in the garden. Charles had clearly not been maintaining the property. Vivian had a key still, hidden in her dress pocket, and she used it to let them in. The interior was dusty and stale, as if no one had been living there for some time. She moved through the rooms quickly, gathering her parents' few precious possessions, her mother's silver locket, her father's books, a quilt her grandmother had made. Everything fit into a single small trunk. They were loading it into their wagon when a neighbor woman approached, her eyes wide with shock. "Vivian, is that really you? We heard you had gone missing." "I was lost for a time," Vivian said carefully. "But I'm well now. I'm leaving Charles, Mrs. Henderson. The marriage is over." The woman's eyes darted to Kade, taking in his size and rough appearance, and understanding dawned on her face. "I see. Well, I cannot say I'm entirely surprised. Your husband has been entertaining a young woman here these past weeks, a saloon girl from down by the waterfront. I do not think he was as heartbroken over your disappearance as he claimed." Vivian's face went pale, then red. So Charles had already replaced her, had already moved on to someone new. The hurt of it surprised her. She had not thought she had any feelings left for him besides fear and disgust, but the casual cruelty still stung. Kade's hand found hers and squeezed gently. "We should go," he murmured. "You got what you came for." They visited a lawyer's office before leaving Sacramento. The lawyer, a thin man with sharp eyes, listened to Vivian's story with growing interest. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "The law in California is complicated when it comes to divorce," he said, "but abandonment is grounds, as is cruelty. If what you are telling me is true, and your husband did indeed leave you in the wilderness to die, that would certainly constitute extreme cruelty." "How long will it take?" Vivian asked. "Months, possibly a year. These things are not quick, but if he is willing to cooperate, as you say he promised, it will go faster. I will file the initial papers and contact his attorney. In the meantime, I advise you to stay far away from him. Do not give him any opportunity to claim you have behaved improperly, as that could be used against you in proceedings." They paid the lawyer's retainer fee and left Sacramento that same afternoon. The journey back to the mountains felt like traveling from darkness into light. The further they got from the city, the easier Vivian could breathe. The months that followed were the happiest of Vivian's life. While they waited for the divorce to be finalized, she and Kade lived in a kind of suspended paradise. They could not marry, not yet, but in every way that mattered, they were already husband and wife. Kade taught her the ways of the mountains. He showed her how to track deer, how to identify edible plants, how to read the weather and the behavior of birds and the feel of the wind. Vivian proved to be an apt student, her mind quick and her hands skilled. She learned to shoot, to trap, to survive in the wilderness that had nearly killed her. In turn, Vivian brought softness to Kade's rough existence. She planted flowers around the cabin, created curtains from fabric they bought on rare trips to town, and filled the evenings with conversation and laughter. She brought books too, purchasing volumes of poetry and adventure stories that they would read aloud to each other by firelight. Their physical relationship deepened naturally. One cold November night, as they sat by the fire, Vivian simply stood, took Kade's hand, and led him to the bed. There were no words needed. They came together with a tenderness and passion that left them both shaken. And afterward, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, Kade knew that whatever legal documents might or might not exist, Vivian was his wife in every way that truly mattered. Winter came to the California mountains, not as harsh as it would have been further north, but cold enough. They spent long evenings wrapped in furs, talking about their future. Kade wanted to expand his property, maybe bring in some cattle in the spring. Vivian talked about starting a proper garden, maybe even some fruit trees. They were building a life together, planning for a future that had seemed impossible just months before. In March of 1880, the divorce papers finally came through. The lawyer sent a letter explaining that Charles had cooperated fully, eager to be done with the whole affair. He had even remarried already to the saloon girl Mrs. Henderson had mentioned. Apparently, he had gotten her pregnant and been forced into the marriage by her brothers. The lawyer's letter contained a note of dry amusement at this development. It seemed Charles had finally met his match in a woman who knew how to protect herself. The day the papers arrived, Kade saddled both horses and took Vivian down to Petaluma. They were married that afternoon by the local minister, with the blacksmith and his wife standing as witnesses. Vivian wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, and Kade had trimmed his beard and tied back his long hair. They spoke their vows in strong, clear voices, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Kade kissed her so thoroughly that the witnesses applauded and laughed. They celebrated with dinner at the town's small hotel restaurant, a rare extravagance. Over roasted chicken and potatoes, Vivian looked at her husband, her actual, legal husband, and felt tears of happiness prick her eyes. "What is it?" Kade asked, immediately concerned. "I'm just so happy," she said, laughing through her tears. "A year ago I was dying on a mountainside. Now I'm married to the best man I've ever known, and I have a home and a future. It feels like a miracle." Kade reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb rubbing across the simple gold band he had placed there during the ceremony. "You are my miracle, Vivian. You brought life back to a man who thought he was done living. I was just existing up in those mountains, getting by day to day. But you gave me a reason to want more than just survival." They rode back up the mountain as the sun was setting, painting the California hills in shades of gold and purple. The cabin looked warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk, smoke rising from the chimney where Kade had banked the morning fire. It was not much, just a simple log structure in the wilderness, but it was theirs, built on love and trust and hard-won freedom. That night, they consummated their marriage properly, taking their time, savoring every touch and kiss. Afterward, as Vivian lay draped across Kade's broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, She felt at peace for the first time in years. "Tell me something," she murmured drowsily. "When you found me that day, did you ever imagine this, that we would end up here?" Kade was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking slowly through her hair. "No," he admitted. "I thought I would save you, help you recover, and send you back to wherever you came from. The idea that you would stay, that you would want to stay, never even crossed my mind. I was certain that once you got your strength back, you would leave these mountains and never look back. And yet here I am. And yet here you are." His arms tightened around her. "My wife, my Vivian." She tilted her head up to kiss him. "Your Vivian," she agreed. "Always." The years that followed were full and rich. Kade expanded his property, bringing in a small herd of cattle and building additional structures, a proper barn, a smokehouse, even a small bunkhouse for when they needed to hire help during calving season. Vivian's garden flourished, and she became known in Petaluma for the quality of her preserves and the herbs she grew. She would ride down to town once a month to trade her goods, and slowly, carefully, she built relationships with the other women of the community. It was not always easy. Some people whispered about the circumstances of their marriage, about the mountain man and the woman who had left her husband. But Vivian held her head high and let her actions speak for themselves. She helped nurse the sick during a bad outbreak of influenza. She taught reading to children whose parents could not afford a proper tutor. She proved through her kindness and her character that she was not the addled, confused woman Charles had once painted her to be. In the fall of 1881, Vivian discovered she was pregnant. She told Kade one evening as they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. He had been whittling a new handle for an axe, and when she spoke the words, his knife slipped and nearly cut his thumb. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice strangled. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be. I have missed 2 monthly courses, and I have been sick in the mornings. Kade, we are going to have a baby." He set down the knife and the half-finished handle very carefully, then stood and picked her up, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "We are going to have a baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "A child. Our child." "Are you happy?" she asked, even though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy? Vivian, I am terrified and thrilled and more grateful than I have words to express. A baby, our baby." He set her down gently, almost reverently, and his large hand came to rest on her still flat stomach. "I'm going to be a father," he said softly. "I never thought I would have this. A wife, a family. I thought I was meant to be alone." "You were never meant to be alone," Vivian said firmly. "You were meant to find me, to save me, and for us to build this life together. Everything that happened, all the pain and fear and struggle, it led us here. To this moment, to this family we are creating." Their son was born in May of 1882, arriving during a warm spring rainstorm. Kade rode through the downpour to fetch the midwife from Petaluma, and when he returned, soaked to the bone and frantic with worry, Vivian was already in hard labor. The midwife took charge with brisk efficiency, and Kade was banished to pace the main room while the women worked. He had faced down Confederate soldiers, grizzly bears, and Charles Vance without flinching, but the sounds of his wife in pain nearly brought him to his knees. He prayed to a God he was not sure he still believed in, making wild bargains and promises if only Vivian and the baby would survive. Just before dawn, a baby's cry split the air, strong and outraged. The midwife opened the bedroom door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Yates, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is doing fine, though she is exhausted." Kade rushed past her into the bedroom. Vivian lay propped against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but glowing with happiness. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket, and when Kade knelt beside the bed, she pulled the fabric back to reveal a tiny red-faced baby with dark hair and a furious expression. "Meet your son," Vivian said softly. "I was thinking we could name him Thomas after my father." "Thomas," Kade repeated, reaching out one massive finger to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. The infant's fingers immediately curled around his, gripping with surprising strength. "Thomas Yates. It is perfect." He looked up at Vivian, tears streaming unashamedly down his bearded face. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving me everything." "We gave it to each other," Vivian replied, reaching up to cup his face. "You saved my life, Kade. And then you gave me a reason to live it fully. This is our family, the family we both deserved." Thomas Yates grew into a strong, curious child who was equally at home in the wilderness or helping his mother in the garden. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's determination, and he brought joy to the little cabin in the mountains that knew no bounds. 2 years after Thomas was born, Vivian gave birth to twin daughters, Rose and Catherine. Kade was beside himself, terrified of breaking the tiny, delicate creatures who seemed impossibly small in his massive hands. But the girls thrived, and they wrapped their father around their little fingers from day one. The cabin had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family. Kade built on 2 additional rooms and a proper loft where the children could sleep. The homestead grew more prosperous with each passing year. Kade's cattle herd increased, and he was able to hire 2 ranch hands to help with the work. Vivian's garden became renowned throughout the county, and she began teaching other women her techniques for preserving food and growing herbs in the challenging mountain climate. On a warm June evening in 1889, 7 years after Thomas was born and 5 years after the twins arrived, Kade and Vivian sat together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. Thomas, now 7 years old, was teaching his 5-year-old sisters how to skip stones in the creek. Their laughter rang through the valley, a sound more precious than any treasure. "Do you ever think about that day?" Vivian asked softly. "The day you found me?" Kade was quiet for a moment, watching his son help Rose find a flatter stone. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to not finding you. If I had gone a different direction that morning, if I had decided to check the traps later, if I had been even a few hours slower, you would have died, and I would have lived out my days alone, never knowing what I had missed. But you did find me, and I did not die. And look at what we have built." She gestured to their home, their land, their children. "We created something beautiful out of something terrible." "You created something beautiful," Kade corrected, pulling her close against his side. "I was just smart enough to hold on when you wandered into my life." Vivian laughed and rested her head on his shoulder. "I did not wander. I was abandoned, left to die, discarded like trash. But you saw value in me when I could not even see it in myself. You saved me in more ways than just pulling me back from death's door." "We saved each other," Kade said firmly. "I was dying up here too, just in a different way. Dying of loneliness and isolation, cutting myself off from everything human. You brought me back to life, Vivian. You reminded me that there was still goodness in the world, still beauty worth fighting for." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower toward the western hills. The sky blazed with color, streaks of orange and pink and purple painting the clouds. It was the same view Kade had seen hundreds of times during his years alone on the mountain, but now it was transformed by the presence of his family, by the life they had built together. "Mama! Papa!" Rose came running up to the porch, her dark braids flying behind her. "Tommy says there are fish in the creek. Can we try to catch one for supper?" Before either parent could answer, Catherine came racing up behind her sister. "I want to catch the biggest one." "You are both too small to fish without help," Thomas said with the world-weary patience of an older brother. "But Papa could help us if he wants." Kade looked down at his children's hopeful faces and could not help but smile. All right, let me get the poles. But you all have to listen to instructions, understand? The creek can be dangerous if you are not careful." The children chorused their agreement and raced back toward the water. Kade stood, stretching his tall frame, then paused to drop a kiss on top of Vivian's head. "Are you coming?" "In a minute. I want to enjoy the sunset a bit longer." She watched as her husband walked down to the creek, their children swarming around him like enthusiastic puppies. He was patient with them, showing Thomas how to bait a hook properly while making sure the twins stayed back from the deeper water. His voice drifted up to her, deep and calm, full of love and gentle instruction. This was her life now. This peaceful evening, this beautiful home, this family that loved and supported each other. It was so far removed from the nightmare of her marriage to Charles, from the horror of being left to die on a mountainside, that sometimes it felt like those things had happened to a different person entirely. but she knew they had happened to her. The scars were still there, faint but present, on her skin and in her memories. The difference was that now she had Kade, had their children, had this life they had built together. The past could not hurt her anymore because the present was so full of love. A shriek of delight pulled her attention back to the creek. Thomas had caught a fish, a decent-sized trout that was flopping on the bank while the twins danced around it in excitement. Kade was laughing, his face transformed by joy, looking years younger than his actual age. Vivian stood and walked down to join her family, wading into the creek despite her shoes and skirts. Kade saw her coming and opened his arms, and she walked into them without hesitation. The children pressed close around them, all talking at once about the fish and whether they could catch another one. "I love you," Vivian said to her husband, loud enough for him to hear over the children's chatter. "I love you too," he replied, his arms tightening around her. "Every day, every moment, forever." They had years ahead of them still, years of joy and struggle, of raising their children and watching them grow. There would be hard winters and dry summers, illnesses and injuries, all the challenges that came with life on the frontier. But they would face it all together, bound by the love that had been forged in the crucible of suffering and survival. Vivian had been left to die on a mountainside by a man who had sworn to love and protect her, but she had been found by a man who actually understood what those words meant, a man who had taken his vows seriously and built a life worthy of them. She had found love in the wilderness, found home in the arms of a mountain man who had proven that true strength was not about domination or control, but about protection and partnership. As the sun finally slipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, the Yates family headed back to their cabin. The children ran ahead, still full of energy despite the long day. Kade and Vivian walked hand in hand, moving slowly, savoring the moment. Inside the cabin, Vivian prepared the fish Thomas had caught while Kade helped the children wash up for supper. They ate together at the large table Kade had built, the children chattering about their day, making plans for tomorrow. After the meal, Vivian read to them from a book of fairy tales, while Kade cleaned up the dishes, and then it was time for bed. The children protested, of course, but they were tired enough that the protests were half-hearted. Kade carried the twins up to the loft while Thomas climbed up on his own, and Vivian followed to tuck them in. She kissed each child goodnight, brushing hair back from sleepy faces, whispering words of love. When she came back down, Kade was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit valley. She moved to stand beside him, and his arm came around her waist automatically. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how lucky I am, about how this could have all turned out so differently, about how grateful I am that fate brought you to my property line that day." "It was not fate," Vivian said. "It was your good heart that made you stop and check instead of riding past. It was your strength that saved me, your kindness that helped me heal, your love that gave me a reason to keep living." Kade turned to her, his dark eyes serious in the lamplight. "You gave me all of that too, you know. I was broken when you came into my life. The war had damaged me in ways I did not even fully understand. I had convinced myself that I was better off alone, that I could not handle being around people anymore. But you showed me that I was wrong. You showed me that I could love and be loved, that I could be part of a family, that I could build something good and lasting." "We built it together," Vivian said firmly. "Everything we have, everything we are, we created it together. You are not broken. Kade, you never were. You were just hurting. And you needed someone to help you heal, the same way I needed you to help me." They stood together in the quiet cabin, holding each other, listening to the soft sounds of their children sleeping in the loft above. Outside, the wind sighed through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. It was the soundtrack of their life, the music of the mountains that had become their home. "I want you to promise me something," Kade said suddenly. Anything. If anything ever happens to me, if I die or get hurt or cannot take care of you anymore, I want you to promise that you will not give up, that you will keep fighting, keep living, keep being the strong woman I know you are. Promise me you will take care of our children and teach them to be good people, the kind of people who help others instead of hurting them." Vivian pulled back to look at him, alarmed by the serious tone. "Nothing is going to happen to you. We are going to grow old together, watch our grandchildren grow up, and die peacefully in our sleep when we are ancient and gray. I hope so. But life is unpredictable, and I need to know that you will be all right, that you will not let fear or grief break you." She reached up to cup his bearded face in both hands. "I promise," she said solemnly. "I promise that I will keep fighting, no matter what. But you have to promise me the same thing. If something happens to me, you have to keep going, for the children, for yourself, for the life we built together." "I promise," he replied, and then he was kissing her, deep and passionate, as if sealing the vow with his lips. They made love that night with a tenderness and intensity that left them both shaken. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the bed they had shared for years, Vivian felt a sense of completeness that was almost overwhelming. This was what life was supposed to be: love and family and home, building something meaningful with someone who truly saw you and valued you. She had almost died on a mountainside, abandoned by a man who had viewed her as nothing more than a burden to be disposed of. But she had survived, and in surviving, she had found something she had never expected: to have a love so deep and true that it had transformed every aspect of her existence. Kade Yates had found her collapsed on his property line, more dead than alive, and instead of walking away, he had chosen to save her. That choice had changed both of their lives forever, had set in motion a chain of events that led to this moment, to this family, this home, this love that bound them together. As Vivian drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had guided Kade to her that day. She had been given a second chance at life, and she had seized it with both hands. She had turned her suffering into strength, her fear into courage, and her near death into a vibrant, joyful existence. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Thomas grew into a serious, responsible young man who wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and work the land. The twins, despite being identical in appearance, developed very different personalities. Rose was adventurous and bold, while Catherine was thoughtful and studious. In 1892, Vivian gave birth to another son, whom they named Matthew, and 2 years after that, a daughter they called Grace rounded out the family. The cabin in the mountains became a real homestead, with multiple buildings, extensive gardens, and a thriving cattle operation. Kade's reputation as an honest, hard-working man spread throughout Sonoma County, and he was often called upon to mediate disputes or offer advice. Vivian's skills as a healer and herbalist became legendary, and women would travel from miles around to seek her counsel. But through it all, the center of their lives remained each other. Every morning, Kade would kiss Vivian goodbye before heading out to work, and every evening they would sit together and talk about their day. They made a point of never going to bed angry, of always communicating openly and honestly. They had both seen what happened when a marriage was based on deception and control, and they were determined to build something different. On their 15th wedding anniversary in 1895, Kade took Vivian back to the exact spot where he had found her all those years ago. It was a place they had avoided, the memories too painful, but now he wanted to reclaim it, to transform it from a site of trauma into a testament to their survival and love. They stood at the property line, hand in hand, looking out over the valley below. Petaluma was visible in the distance, much larger now than it had been in 1879. The world was changing. Electricity and telephones were coming to California, and there was talk of automobiles that could travel without horses. But up here in the mountains, life moved at the same steady pace it always had. "Do you remember what you thought when you first saw me?" Vivian asked, her gray eyes distant with memory. "I thought I had found a body," Kade admitted. "I thought I was too late, and then I felt for your pulse and found that spark of life still there, and I knew I had to do everything in my power to keep it burning. You did more than keep it burning. You fanned it into a flame that has lit up my entire life." She squeezed his hand. "I do not like to think about what would have happened if you had not found me, or if you had found me and decided I was not worth the trouble of saving." "You were always worth it," Kade said fiercely. "From that first moment, you were worth it, and every day since has only proven that truth more thoroughly." They walked back to the cabin slowly, taking their time, enjoying the warm spring sunshine. The children were supposed to be doing chores, but as they approached the house, they could hear laughter and splashing coming from the creek. Kade and Vivian exchanged amused glances clearly. The children had decided that playing in the water was more important than mucking out stalls, but neither of them felt like scolding. It was too beautiful a day, and their happiness was too complete. The chores would get done eventually. For now, let the children play and be young. That evening, after the children were finally in bed and the cabin was quiet, Kade presented Vivian with a gift. It was a book, leather-bound and clearly expensive, with blank pages waiting to be filled. "I want you to write our story," he said. "Everything that happened from the day I found you until now. I want our children to know where they came from, what we survived, how we built this life. And I want their children and their children's children to know too. I want our legacy to be more than just land and cattle. I want it to be the story of how love can triumph over cruelty, how hope can survive even in the darkest moments." Vivian held the book carefully, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "I do not know if I can write it. Some of it is still so painful to remember." "Then write the good parts. Write about the life we built, the love we share, the family we created. Write about how you refused to let one evil man destroy your capacity for joy and trust. That is the story that matters, Vivian. Not what he did to you, but what you did in spite of him." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "All right, I will write it, for our children, and for anyone else who needs to know that survival is possible, that healing is real, that happy endings do exist." And she did. Over the following months and years, Vivian filled the pages of that book with their story. She wrote about the pain and fear of her first marriage, but she wrote more about the love and security of her second. She wrote about Kade's strength and gentleness, about the family they built, about the life they created in the California mountains. She wrote about second chances and the power of kindness, about what it meant to truly love and be loved in return. The children grew up hearing pieces of the story, age-appropriate versions that taught them important lessons about character and courage. As they got older, they read the full account, and it gave them a deep appreciation for what their parents had overcome to create the family and home they enjoyed. Thomas eventually took over the ranch when Kade's joints started to ache too much for the hard physical labor. He married a local girl and had children of his own, building a house just down the hill from his parents' cabin. The twins both married as well, Rose to a doctor who had come west seeking adventure, and Catherine to a teacher who shared her love of books and learning. Matthew became a skilled horseman and traveled throughout California working on various ranches before finally settling down near his siblings. Grace, the baby of the family, showed such talent for healing that she eventually went to San Francisco to study nursing, then returned to Petaluma to open a small clinic. Through it all, Kade and Vivian remained the center of their growing family. They became grandparents many times over, and their cabin in the mountains became a gathering place for holidays and celebrations. They were the example all their children and grandchildren looked to when they thought about what a marriage should be, a partnership built on respect, trust, and genuine affection. In 1910, on a warm June evening, much like the one 30 years earlier when Vivian had asked if Kade remembered the day he found her, they sat together on their porch. They were older now, moving more slowly, hair gone silver and faces lined with age. But their hands still found each other automatically, and their eyes still lit up when they looked at one another. "Do you have any regrets?" Vivian asked. It was a question she had asked him many times over the years, always receiving the same answer. "Only that I did not find you sooner," Kade replied, as he always did. "Every year with you has been a gift, but I wish we could have had more of them." "We have had 31 years together," Vivian pointed out. 31 years of love and family and happiness. That is more than many people get in a lifetime. It is not enough. 1,000 years would not be enough. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Vivian Yates. Finding you that day was the moment my real life began." "And you saved mine in every way a person can be saved," she replied. "You gave me back my life, my hope, my ability to trust and love. You gave me a family and a home. You gave me everything." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the mountains they both loved. Their children and grandchildren were scattered across California now, living their own lives, building their own families. But they all carried forward the lessons Kade and Vivian had taught them about kindness, about strength, about the kind of love that endured through every trial. Kade passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1912 at the age of 73. Vivian was holding his hand when he drew his last breath, and though her heart shattered at the loss, she kept her promise. She did not give up. She continued to live, to love her children and grandchildren, to maintain the home they had built together. She lived another 8 years, long enough to see the end of the Great War, long enough to watch several of her grandchildren marry and have children of their own. She spent her final years adding to the book Kade had given her, ensuring that every detail of their remarkable story was preserved for future generations. When Vivian Yates finally closed her eyes for the last time in 1920, at the age of 65, she was surrounded by family in the cabin where she had spent the happiest years of her life. Her last words were about Kade, about how she would see him again soon, about how their love had never truly ended. The family buried her beside her husband on a hillside overlooking the valley, not far from the spot where he had first found her. A simple stone marked both their graves, inscribed with their names and the dates of their lives. But their true legacy was not in stone. It was in the dozens of descendants who carried their blood, in the lessons of courage and compassion they had passed down, in the story of love, triumphant, that inspired everyone who heard it. The cabin in the mountains remained in the family for generations. It was expanded and modernized over time, but the original structure that Kade had built was carefully preserved. The book Vivian had written was copied and distributed among family members, becoming a treasured heirloom that reminded each new generation of where they had come from. And on quiet evenings, when the wind sighed through the pine trees and the sun set in brilliant colors over the western hills, people in the valley would sometimes talk about the mountain man and the woman he had saved. They told the story of how Kade Yates had found Vivian collapsed on his property line, how her husband had left her there to perish, and how instead of dying, she had found a love and a life beyond anything she could have imagined. It was a story about cruelty and kindness, about betrayal and loyalty, about death and rebirth. But most of all, it was a story about love, the kind of love that saves lives, that builds families, that transforms tragedy into triumph. It was a story that proved that even in the darkest moments, when all hope seems lost, salvation can arrive in unexpected forms. And it was a story that ended not with death, but with legacy, with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the values and love of two remarkable people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the ashes of despair. The mountains of California have witnessed countless stories over the centuries, tales of gold seekers and homesteaders, of triumph and tragedy. But few stories have resonated as deeply or endured as completely as that of Kade and Vivian Yates, the mountain man and the woman he saved, who together proved that love is the strongest force in the universe, capable of healing any wound and overcoming any obstacle. Their story lived on, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of second chances and the extraordinary things that can happen when two wounded souls find each other and choose to heal together. It reminded everyone who heard it that no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. No matter how desperate the situation, hope survives. And no matter how broken you might feel, love has the power to make you whole again. This was their legacy. This was their gift to the world, the knowledge that happy endings are not just for fairy tales, that real love exists and can flourish even in the harshest conditions, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead directly to the best. Kade found Vivian when she was at her lowest point, when death seemed certain and hope was gone. But he did not just save her life, he showed her what life could be when shared with someone who truly cared. And Vivian, in turn, saved Kade from a different kind of death, the slow withering of the soul that comes from isolation and loneliness. Together, they created not just a family, but a dynasty, not just a home, but a sanctuary, not just a marriage, but a partnership that became the gold standard against which all their descendants would measure their own relationships. The sun set over the California mountains, casting long shadows across the valley where Petaluma sprawled in the distance. The cabin on the hillside stood solid and strong, weathered by years but still standing, much like the love story it represented. And if you listened carefully on quiet evenings, some said you could still hear echoes of laughter from children long grown, still catch glimpses of a large muscular man with long hair and gentle eyes, walking hand in hand with a woman whose gray eyes sparkled with joy and love. Their bodies had returned to the earth they had worked so hard, but their spirits remained intertwined, bound together by a love that death itself could not sever. They had started with tragedy, with abandonment and cruelty and near death, but they had transformed that tragedy into something transcendent, building a life so full of love and meaning that it continued to inspire long after they were gone. This was the story of Kade and Vivian Yates. This was the story of how a mountain man found a woman collapsed on his property line and chose compassion over indifference, how that choice led to a love affair that would span decades and create ripples through generations. This was the story of survival and healing, of justice and redemption, of two people who refused to let their past define their future. And it was a story with a happy ending, not because there were no struggles or sorrows, but because the love at its center was strong enough to weather every storm. They built something lasting, something meaningful, something beautiful. And in doing so, they proved that even when someone leaves you to perish, even when the world seems intent on destroying you, there is always the possibility of salvation, always the chance that someone will find you and choose to save you, always the hope that love will triumph in the end. That was their story. That was their truth. That was their legacy. And it lived on, generation after generation, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt abandoned, anyone who had ever been betrayed, anyone who had ever wondered if they would survive the darkness and find their way back to the light. The answer, as Kade and Vivian had proven beyond any doubt, was yes. Yes, you can survive. Yes, you can heal. Yes, you can find love even after the worst betrayal. Yes, you can build a beautiful life from the rubble of a shattered one. Yes, happy endings are real and possible and worth fighting for. Their story ended not with tragedy but with triumph, not with separation but with eternal union, not with despair but with hope. And that was exactly how it should be, exactly how they would have wanted it, exactly how their descendants would remember them as two people who found each other in the wilderness, both literal and figurative, and built a love so strong and true that it echoed through time itself, inspiring everyone who heard it to believe in the power of second chances and the reality of true love.